I thought I was just fixing another broken transmission that Tuesday morning, but when I crawled under that old veteran's truck, I discovered something that would change both our lives forever. My name is Valentina Chen, but everyone calls me Val. I'm 26 years old and I run Chen's Auto Repair in Millbrook, Tennessee, a shop my grandfather built with his own hands back in 1967. Most people around here still can't believe a girl knows her way around an engine block, but I've been turning wrenches since I was tall enough to reach the toolbox. The man whose truck nearly broke my world open that morning was Garrison Blackwood. Gary, as he insisted I call him, had been coming to our shop for 8 years. He was 68, quiet as morning fog, and drove the same beat-up 1987 Ford pickup that rattled like a can of marbles every time he pulled into my bay. Gary was what my grandfather used to call good people. The kind of customer who paid his bills in cash, never complained about the wait, and always asked about my family like he genuinely cared about the answer. But Gary carried himself like a man with weight on his shoulders, the kind of invisible burden that makes people walk a little slower and speak a little softer. His eyes had that distant look I'd seen in some of my grandfather's old army buddies, like part of him was always somewhere else. He wore dog tags under his work shirt that caught the light when he leaned over to sign his invoices, and his hands had the kind of steady shake that comes from holding on to something too heavy for too long. I had no idea that morning that Gary's old Ford was carrying a secret that had been waiting 47 years to surface. I had no idea that what I thought would be a simple transmission repair would turn into the most important day of both our lives. All I knew was that Gary seemed more nervous than usual when he dropped off his keys, checking his watch like he had somewhere important to be, and asking me twice if I was sure I could have it ready by closing time. If I had known what was waiting for me under that truck, bolted to the transmission housing like some kind of mechanical time capsule, I might have told Gary to take his Ford somewhere else. But I didn't know, and sometimes the most important moments of our lives start with the most ordinary decisions. Sometimes fixing what's broken means discovering what was never supposed to be hidden in the first place. 6 months before that life-changing Tuesday, my grandfather had passed away in his sleep, leaving me with nothing but Chen's Auto Repair, a mountain of debt, and the crushing weight of carrying on a family legacy I wasn't sure I was strong enough to handle. Grandpa Chen had built this shop from nothing after he came back from Korea, and for 55 years it had been the heartbeat of Millbrook's small business district. Now it was just me, a 26-year-old woman in coveralls, trying to prove to an entire town that I belonged under the hood of their trucks and cars. The financial reality was harsh and getting harsher every day. Without Grandpa's reputation and decades of relationships carrying me, customers were starting to drift away to the new Jiffy Lube that had opened up on the highway. My monthly revenue had dropped by almost 40%, and the bank had started sending letters about the business loan that Grandpa had taken out 2 years before he died to update the equipment. I was 3 months behind on payments and running out of options fast. The isolation was almost worse than the money problems. Millbrook had exactly one other female business owner, Martha, who ran the flower shop, and she was 67 years old. Every day I walked into that garage, I could feel the weight of being different, of having to work twice as hard to earn half the respect that any man with a wrench would get automatically. My ex-fiancé Derek hadn't helped matters when he decided that dating a mechanic was fun, but marrying one was beneath his ambitious plans for corporate success. "Find a real job, Val," he had said during our final fight 3 weeks earlier. "You're smart enough to do something that doesn't leave you covered in grease every day." He couldn't understand that this wasn't just a job for me. This was home. This was family. This was everything my grandfather had worked for, wrapped up in 4 walls and a hydraulic lift. Gary Blackwood had been one of the few constants during those difficult months. Every 6 weeks, like clockwork, his old Ford would rumble into my bay, usually needing something minor but essential: an oil change, a belt replacement, brake pads that had worn down to metal. Gary never questioned my expertise or asked if there was a man around to double-check my work. He treated me exactly the same way he had treated my grandfather, with quiet respect and unwavering trust. My grandfather had always given Gary a discount, usually knocking 20% off whatever the repair cost. When I asked him about it once, Grandpa had just shrugged and said, "That man served his country. We serve him back." I had continued the tradition without question, partly out of respect for my grandfather's wishes, but mostly because Gary seemed like he needed every dollar he could save. Gary lived alone in a tiny house about 10 miles outside town, the kind of place where the mailbox was the only sign that someone called it home. He worked part-time at the hardware store, stocking shelves and helping customers find what they needed. But I got the sense that his real job was just getting through each day. He had never married as far as I knew, and never mentioned family or friends. When he spoke, it was usually about the weather or my grandfather's health back when Grandpa was still alive. The past seemed to be off-limits territory for Gary Blackwood. That Tuesday morning started like any other, with me opening the bay doors at 7 sharp and Gary's Ford pulling in 20 minutes later. But something was different about Gary from the moment he stepped out of the truck. His usual steady demeanor was replaced by nervous energy that made him fidget with his keys and check his watch every few minutes. "Miss Val," he said, and his voice had a tremor in it I had never heard before. "She's acting up again, won't shift into third gear properly, and there's this grinding noise when I try to accelerate up hills." I wiped my hands on my coveralls and walked around the truck, listening to the engine idle. The grinding was subtle but definitely there, probably coming from the transmission, a standard repair that I had done dozens of times before. "Sounds like your transmission bands might be slipping," I told him, popping the hood to take a look. "I'll need to get her up on the lift and take a closer look, but it's probably going to run you around $400 for parts and labor." Gary nodded quickly, too quickly, like he just wanted to get the conversation over with. "That's fine, Miss Val, whatever it takes. I just need her running right again." He handed me his keys and then did something he had never done before. He asked me when I could have it finished. "Well, it's Tuesday morning and I've got 2 other jobs ahead of you," I said. "Probably Thursday afternoon if everything goes smoothly." The color drained out of Gary's face. "Thursday? Is there any way you could have it ready today, by closing time? I can pay extra if you need to rush it." I had never seen Gary in a hurry for anything. Time seemed to move differently for him, like he had learned long ago that rushing never fixed anything that mattered. But that morning, time suddenly seemed very important to Gary Blackwood, and I found myself wondering why. I agreed to prioritize Gary's truck, partly because he seemed so anxious, and partly because I needed the money more than I needed to stick to my regular schedule. After he left to walk over to Martha's flower shop to kill time, I got his Ford up on the hydraulic lift and started my inspection. The grinding noise was definitely coming from the transmission, but as I crawled underneath to get a better look, something caught my eye that made me stop cold. There was a metal box welded to the underside of the transmission housing, not bolted on like an aftermarket modification, but welded with military precision using techniques I had only seen in specialized applications. The box was roughly the size of a shoebox, painted flat black to match the transmission casing, and sealed so well that it looked like it had been there since the truck rolled off the assembly line. But I knew Ford's manufacturing specs, and this was definitely not standard equipment. The box had been crafted by someone who knew what they were doing. The welds were perfect, professional grade, and the metal showed signs of being treated to resist corrosion. Whatever was inside had been meant to stay hidden for a very long time. When I tapped on it with my wrench, something shifted inside with a soft rattling sound, like papers or small objects moving around in a confined space. Spent 20 minutes examining the box from every angle, looking for any way to access it without cutting through the welds. Finally, I found a small keyhole hidden under a rubber plug near the back corner. The lock mechanism was simple but sturdy, the kind that would need a specific key to open. My grandfather had taught me that when you find something unusual on a customer's vehicle, you discuss it with them before doing anything else. But something about this discovery made my stomach tighten with worry. When Gary returned an hour later carrying a cup of coffee from the diner down the street, I was waiting for him in the office with my hands folded on the desk. The expression on my face must have told him everything he needed to know, because the color drained out of his cheeks before I even said a word. "Mr. Blackwood, there's something attached to your truck that I've never seen before," I said, keeping my voice as gentle as possible. A metal container welded to the transmission housing, It's been there a long time, and it's not part of the original truck. Gary set his coffee cup down with shaking hands and stared at the floor for what felt like forever. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes had the same haunted expression I had seen in old photographs of soldiers coming home from war. "You weren't supposed to find that," he whispered. "Nobody was ever supposed to find that." I watched him struggle with something internal, his hands clenching and unclenching like he was trying to hold on to thoughts that kept slipping away. The dog tags around his neck caught the afternoon light streaming through the office window, and for the first time I noticed they weren't just his own. There were 2 sets hanging from that chain. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not going to do anything without your permission," I said. "But if there's something dangerous in there, or if someone is using your truck to transport something illegal, I need to know. I have a responsibility to my shop and my community." Gary stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at his truck suspended on the lift. "Some things are better left buried, Miss Val. Some secrets are meant to stay secret." "But this is your truck," I pointed out. "Whatever's in that box, you put it there. You had it welded on purpose, with a lock that needs a key. That's not something you do by accident." He turned around to face me, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "It's been there for 47 years, since I came back from Vietnam." His voice broke on the word Vietnam like it physically hurt him to say it. The pieces started falling into place. The 2 sets of dog tags, the careful construction of the hidden compartment, the way Gary carried himself like he was bearing the weight of more than just his own life. "There was another soldier," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Gary nodded and sat back down heavily in the chair across from my desk. "Danny Reeves. He was my best friend over there, closer to me than any brother I could have had. This was his truck before it was mine. What happened to Danny? He died saving my life." Gary's voice was barely above a whisper. "Took a bullet that was meant for me, and with his last breath he made me promise to do something for him. Something I've been too much of a coward to do for almost 5 decades. I felt my heart break a little for this man who had been carrying such a heavy burden for so long. And whatever you promised him is in that box. Everything he wanted his family to have. Everything I should have given them years ago, but I couldn't face them. How do you look someone in the eye and tell them their son died because of you?" Gary pulled a small brass key from his pocket and placed it on my desk. "I've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, Miss Val. Early stages, but it's coming fast. Soon I won't remember where I put this key, or why it matters, or what promise I made to a dying friend in a jungle halfway around the world. My nephew keeps telling me I should sell this old truck to the scrapyard before it dies completely." The weight of what he was telling me settled over the office like a heavy blanket. Gary wasn't just asking me to fix his transmission. He was asking me to help him face the biggest regret of his life before his mind slipped away completely. I stared at that brass key sitting on my desk and felt the weight of a decision that would change everything. Here was a man who had carried a promise for 47 years, slowly losing his memory to a disease that would eventually steal every precious detail of his friend's sacrifice. Gary sat across from me with tears in his eyes, waiting for me to tell him what we were going to do next. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, picking up the key and feeling how warm it was from being in his pocket. "Probably. For decades. My grandfather always said you were a good man. He never told me why he gave you those discounts, but I think I understand now. Whatever's in that box, whatever promise you made to Danny, we're going to handle it together." Gary looked at me like I had just offered to carry half the world on my shoulders. "Miss Val, you don't understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about opening a box. This is about facing people I should have faced 47 years ago. This is about admitting that I let fear keep me from doing the right thing." I stood up and walked around the desk to sit in the chair next to him instead of across from him. "Then maybe it's time to stop being afraid. Maybe it's time to keep that promise you made to your friend." "I can't do it alone," he whispered. "I've tried so many times over the years. I've driven halfway to where his family lives and turned around. I've written letters I never sent. I've picked up the phone and hung up before anyone could answer. Every time I think about facing them, I see Danny dying in my arms, and I lose my nerve. What if you didn't have to do it alone? Gary looked up at me with something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, what if we open that box together right here in my shop where you feel safe? And then what if we figured out together what Danny would want you to do with whatever's inside? For a long moment, Gary didn't say anything. He just stared at his hands, which were shaking slightly with age and emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been all day. His name was Danny Reeves, and he was from a little town called Riverside, about 300 miles east of here. He was 22 years old, and he had just become a father, right before we deployed. He carried a picture of his baby daughter everywhere, showed it to anyone who would look, said her name was Cordelia, and she was the most beautiful baby girl who ever lived. Gary pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph that looked like it had been handled thousands of times. It showed a young man in military fatigues, holding a tiny baby, both of them grinning at the camera. Danny never got to see her grow up, never got to teach her to ride a bike or help her with homework or walk her down the aisle, but he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would make sure his family knew how much he loved them and how proud he was to serve his country. I studied the photograph, seeing the resemblance between the young soldier and the old man sitting next to me. They had the same eyes, the same gentle smile, the same way of holding themselves like they were ready to protect everyone around them. You said his family lives 300 miles away. Do you know if they're still there? Gary nodded slowly. I looked them up about 10 years ago when the guilt got so bad I couldn't sleep. His sister Cordelia still lives in Riverside. She's married now, has kids of her own. I found her address, even drove by her house once, but I couldn't bring myself to knock on the door. What stopped you? How do you walk up to someone's door and tell them their brother died because of you? How do you explain that you've been keeping his final words to himself for 47 years because you were too much of a coward to deliver them? I took his hand in both of mine, feeling how cold his fingers were despite the warm afternoon. Mr. Blackwood, what if it's not about you being a coward? What if it's about you being human? What if Danny's family has been wondering about his last days for all these years, and you're the only person who can give them the answers they need? Gary was quiet for a long time, thinking about what I had said. Finally, he looked up at me, with determination I hadn't seen in him before. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. I want to wait until after closing time, when there's no chance of anyone interrupting us. And I need to tell you about Danny first, about what really happened over there and why I feel responsible for his death. Okay. We'll close up at 6 and then we'll open that box together. But Mr. Blackwood, I need you to promise me something. What's that? Promise me that no matter what we find in there, no matter how scared you get, you won't change your mind about doing the right thing. Danny's been waiting 47 years for you to keep your word. Don't make him wait any longer. Gary squeezed my hand and nodded. I promise, Miss Val. God help me, I promise. At 6:30 that evening, after I had locked the front door and turned off the main lights, Gary and I stood beneath his truck with the brass key between us. The hidden compartment looked even more mysterious in the dim glow of my work lights, like a secret that had been waiting decades to be told. Gary's hands were shaking as he reached up toward the keyhole, and I had to help steady his arm so he could insert the key properly. The lock turned with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire garage. Gary pulled his hand back like the metal had burned him, and for a moment we both just stared at the slightly open compartment door. Whatever was inside had been sealed away since 1977, and I could smell the faint scent of old paper and metal preservation oil seeping out. "You do it," Gary whispered. "I can't. After all these years, I still can't." I reached up and carefully pulled the compartment door fully open. Inside was a collection of items wrapped in heavy-duty plastic and military-grade preservation materials. Everything had been packed with the kind of meticulous care that comes from knowing these objects might be the last remaining pieces of someone's entire existence. The first thing I pulled out was a bundle of letters tied together with a faded red ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still clear and strong. Every envelope was addressed to Mrs. Dorothy Reeves and baby Cordelia in Danny's careful script. There were at least 20 letters, maybe more, all sealed and never sent. He wrote to his family every week, Gary said, his voice thick with emotion, even when we were in the worst fighting. even when we didn't know if we'd survive the next day. Danny would find time to write to his mother and his baby girl. He wanted them to know what he was thinking, what he was feeling, how much he missed them. The next item was wrapped in military issue cloth and felt heavy in my hands. When I unwrapped it, I found myself holding a Purple Heart medal along with several other military decorations. The medal was pristine, never displayed, never shown to anyone. Attached to the ribbon was a small card with Danny's full name and service record. The Army sent these to his family after he died, Gary explained. But Danny had asked me to hold on to them first, to make sure they understood what they meant. He wanted someone who was there to explain to his mother exactly what her son had done to earn them. I found photographs next, dozens of them showing Danny with his fellow soldiers, Danny writing letters, Danny smiling at the camera while holding up letters from home. But the most heartbreaking image was a professional portrait of Danny in his dress uniform, the kind that families display on mantles and carry in their wallets forever. At the bottom of the compartment was something that made Gary break down completely. It was a hand-carved wooden jewelry box, small and delicate, with 4 Cordelia etched into the lid in Danny's handwriting. Inside was a simple gold locket that opened to reveal a tiny picture of Danny on one side and an inscription on the other that read, "Daddy loves you forever." He made that jewelry box himself during the quiet times between missions, Gary sobbed. Spent weeks carving it with his combat knife, sanding it with pieces of metal until it was smooth as silk. He said every little girl deserved something beautiful from her daddy, even if he couldn't be there to give it to her in person. But the most devastating discovery was a thick envelope addressed to Gary himself in Danny's handwriting. Inside was a letter that began, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home, and you did." The letter went on to explain that Gary was not responsible for Danny's death, that Danny had made his own choice to push his friend out of the way of incoming fire because that's what brothers do for each other. "I never knew this letter existed," Gary whispered as I read portions of it aloud. "For 47 years I've believed I was responsible for his death, and here he was telling me that saving my life was his choice, his honor, his way of making sure someone would make it home to tell the story." The letter ended with specific instructions about contacting Danny's family and a map showing exactly where his sister Cordelia lived in Riverside. Danny had even included her phone number and a suggestion for what Gary should say when he called. "He planned for everything," I said, looking at all the items spread out on my workbench. Danny knew there was a chance he wouldn't make it home, so he prepared everything his family would need to understand who he was and how much he loved them. Gary picked up the wooden jewelry box and held it against his chest. "Cordelia is 47 years old now. She's probably got daughters of her own who never knew they had a grandfather who carved jewelry boxes and wrote love letters and died protecting his best friend. So what are we going to do about that?" I asked. Gary looked at me with eyes that were clearer than they had been all day. "We're going to drive to Riverside tomorrow morning, and I'm finally going to keep the promise I made to my best friend. Will you come with me, Miss Val? I don't think I can face Danny's family alone." "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "I wouldn't let you do this alone for anything in the world." The next morning I closed Chen's Auto Repair for the first time in its 58-year history for something other than a holiday or a funeral. Gary and I loaded Danny's belongings carefully into the passenger seat of his old Ford, and we began the hembowed 300-mile journey to Riverside with the weight of 47 years of unfinished business sitting between us like a third passenger. Gary had barely slept the night before, but he looked more peaceful than I had ever seen him. The crushing burden that had bent his shoulders for nearly 5 decades seemed lighter now that he was finally moving toward keeping his promise instead of running from it. We drove mostly in comfortable silence, stopping only for gas and coffee, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what we were about to do. Cordelia Reeves Martinez lived in a neat blue house with white shutters on a quiet street lined with oak trees. Her mailbox read, "The Martinez family" in cheerful yellow letters, and children's bicycles were scattered across the front lawn. As we sat in the truck gathering our courage, I watched Gary stare at the house where Danny's little girl had grown up without her father. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Gary asked for the 10th time since we'd left Millbrook. "What if hearing about Danny just brings back pain she spent her whole life trying to forget?" Then we'll deal with that together too, I said, squeezing his arm. But Gary, what if she's been waiting her whole life to hear these stories? What if she's been wondering what her father was really like, and you're the only person left who can tell her? When Cordelia opened her front door, I saw Danny's eyes looking back at us. She was 47 years old with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but the resemblance to the young soldier in the photographs was unmistakable. She stared at Gary for a long moment before her hand flew to her mouth in recognition. "You're Garrison Blackwood," she whispered. "Oh my God, you're Gary. You're the one who's been sending the Christmas cards all these years." Gary's face went white with surprise. "You knew? I've known for 20 years, Cordelia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My mother kept every single card you sent, even though you never signed them. She always said Danny's army friend was watching over us, making sure we were okay. She died hoping she'd get to meet you someday, and thank you for keeping her son's memory alive." What followed was 3 hours of healing that I will never forget as long as I live. Gary told Cordelia stories about her father that no one else on earth could tell. He described Danny's laugh, his habit of writing letters by flashlight, his fierce pride in becoming a father, and his absolute certainty that he was fighting for something worth dying for. Cordelia listened to every word with the hunger of someone who had been starving for these details her entire life. When Gary gave her Danny's letters, Cordelia held them against her chest and sobbed. "I used to wonder what he was thinking about over there, if he missed us, if he was scared. Now I'll finally know." The wooden jewelry box broke down all of us. Cordelia's teenage daughter came downstairs during our visit, and when Gary explained that her grandfather had carved the box with his own hands for a granddaughter he would never meet, 4 generations of love seemed to fill that living room at once. The girl put on the locket immediately and announced she would never take it off. But the most healing moment came when Cordelia pulled out a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings, military documents, and photographs of Danny. She had spent her entire life collecting every piece of information she could find about her father, trying to piece together who he was from official records and formal condolences. Gary was able to fill in all the human details that no government document could ever capture. "He was proud of you," Gary told her as we prepared to leave. "Every letter he wrote mentioned how excited he was to watch you grow up, how he hoped you'd be strong and smart and kind. He would be so proud of the woman you became, of the family you've built, of the life you've created." The drive home to Millbrook was completely different from the morning journey. Gary seemed 20 years younger. Like a weight had been lifted from his soul that had been crushing him for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. We talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time since I'd known him, Gary told me stories about his own life, his own dreams, his own hopes for the future. 3 months later, Gary sold his house and moved to Riverside to be closer to Cordelia and her family. Before he left, he signed over the title of Danny's truck to me, along with enough money to pay off the shop's debts and upgrade my equipment. The truck sits in my garage now, not as a customer's vehicle, but as a reminder that some stories are worth preserving, some promises are worth keeping, and sometimes the most important repair work we do has nothing to do with engines or transmissions. I learned that day that I wasn't just a mechanic. I was a keeper of stories, a bridge between past and present, and sometimes exactly what someone needs to finally come home from a war that ended decades ago.